Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week is a considerable amount of disappointment, starting with a midwife who was barred from providing her healthcare services after entering false data into the vaccine reporting system, a world first curing of a deadly brain cancer for children. The plague in America has been confirmed by the authorities responsible for handling these things, presumably a plague doctor. A hybrid food has been made that combines the benefits of being able to grow rice and produce much of it with having beef inside said rice. This has feelings of the turducken to it. There is no risk to children or pregnant women from eating GMOs, and yet further critiques of the American Association of Pediatrics are coming out, mostly rehashing the same information, but they're well-deserved criticisms. At the same time as the AAP criticizes GMOs, China embraces them and relaxes its rules regarding importing of seeds. Viruses are being found in melting Tibetan glaciers, and we all know how that ends if Hollywood has anything to say. The US nuclear weapons program has finally received its necessary update, no longer requiring exceptionally large floppy disks, which is a small improvement. A Russian cosmonaut has now broken the world's record, well, in this case the space record, for longest time outside of Earth's atmosphere. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with healthcare that's not doing what it should be. A midwife is one of two individuals receiving considerable penalties in New York. It's New York, nobody's surprised at what goes on there, but this is disappointing nonetheless. The other was a homeopath. Both of them were engaged in falsifying data around COVID-19 vaccines. The midwife was entering false data into the vaccine record system, claiming that children had been vaccinated, when all they'd been given was an injection of saline water, which doesn't provide anything. All it does is add a small amount of water to the body and create a slight bump, which goes away in very short order. There is no immunological benefit. By contrast, we have the joy of homeopaths. The only distinction between the homeopath in this case and the midwife in New York is state. The homeopath was in California and has been sentenced to 3 years in prison. The sentencing was for a relatively straightforward reason. They were selling pellets they claimed would provide immunization to COVID-19. If it's anything like the other homeopathic solutions, any possible theoretical, hypothetical, far-off distant universe benefit you might obtain is so watered down as to be practically useless. And so, using that to justify a COVID-19 vaccination is, well, really not worth it. It's basically you've taken a sugar pill and claim immunity. You get no immunity from this. If sugar pills prevented diseases, everybody would be diabetic, which is something of an irony. Understand, the effects of these two are not just limited to the fact that they themselves engaged in a ridiculous hanky-panky, but the children themselves, the families, and the schools are all going to be affected. For example, children in New York who were supposedly vaccinated are now excluded from school until they are properly vaccinated, and then they're allowed to return. This not only disrupts the children's education, but the family itself, with having to care for kids unexpectedly, the issues around getting new shots and everything else. A lot of this is not just a mild inconvenience, it actually has big impact. And, well, the homeopath is going to jail. We can't really say much more than that, other than that, yeah, they're going to be having a lot more issues. More so since, while the New York individual had 1,500 children, the Californian homeopath had 12,500. Yeah. Of course, it's no wonder, given the next news item, that people are, let's say, engaging in this. Given somewhat older news, but news that is just as, if not more disappointing, people were sticking potatoes up their butt to try and solve hemorrhoids. That is not what you use a potato for. Or is it potato? Either way, it doesn't matter. The point is, don't put potatoes up your butt. It's amazing that needs to be said, but nonetheless, understand, that's not where they go. Put them in the pantry, in a cupboard, somewhere else to store them. But if you're not going to store them, use them for food. The theory behind this ridiculous home remedy is that the potato is meant to help with hemorrhoids. No. The potato will do nothing for your hemorrhoids. To be clear, it is likely that the individuals experienced some short-lived relief from their pain. To be clear, they experienced that because they're shoving a cold potato, and in some websites a frozen potato slice, into their anus. That cold will numb the site. The same thing would be achieved with an ice cube. It's frozen. It's so cold, the nerves stop working, therefore you stop feeling pain. It's got nothing to do with it being a potato, just that it's frozen. The challenge you'll face with this is that, theoretically, this could actually lead to more problems with your butt. Particularly that the potato, depending on how you've gone and made it, may be carrying various diseases and other pathogens. As a result, you're now going to experience the joy of having to, let's say, go on the various treatments, most likely a somewhat invasive treatment, more so than the wedge of potato, to get the bacterial infection under control. You're better off just taking pain relief and waiting for the hemorrhoids to go away. Frustration aside, there is better news which involves treating children with cancer. Generally speaking, this is something most people would be on the side of, assuming you don't hate children. If you do, this is probably just as disappointing as the New York midwife, Californian homeopath, and butt potatoes. It involves a child who at the age of 6 was diagnosed with a brain cancer. The brain cancer was effectively untreatable at the time, and this means one very simple thing. The oncologist had to tell the parents their child was going to die. Fortunately, the Belgian boy has theoretically been cured of it at this stage, through a treatment that has left no trace of the tumour. Just remember, the diagnosis was at the age of 6, and now the child is 13. It is a somewhat experimental treatment. The reason they had to use the experimental treatment is that the brain cancer that was affecting the child in question is called diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, and it affects about 300 children in the USA and about 100 in France. Those who are diagnosed have a fairly grim prospect. About 2 years is the outlook for most of the children. 90% of them will die in 2 years. The other 10% will go on to survive for a little bit longer. The new treatment raises that number considerably for the 5-year mark, mind you, not a lifetime. About 85% of the children treated this way will survive more than 5 years. The reason we're talking about French numbers and American numbers is that the Belgian child and their family had to travel to France to become involved in this clinical trial. And that's one of the issues here. There's not a lot of hope depending on where you are in the world. Some countries are far more grim than others. The other important element to this is that the child in question was one of a number involved in the clinical trial. However, of those many children, his is the only one that completely went into remission. It's gone. The other children's had theirs shrink, which is key here. This is why the majority of children aren't, let's say, likely to experience the same results, and why most of them are 85% over 5 years, not lifetime free of cancer, and therein lies the distinct difference. The upside is that the nature of the tumor in the child that's key to this particular news headline is that their mutations may highlight ways to take the drugs involved and make them more effective for those who don't have the same mutations within their cancer, and thereby make it possible to increase the rate of remission and the duration of it. However, the result of that development will be 10, 15, or even more years away. Not exactly the next big thing in oncology, unfortunately. In similar treatment-related news, we have a brain implant for OCD and epilepsy, which is a interesting mixture to use it for. The woman who's received the implant had debilitating OCD and, unfortunately, subject to epilepsy. While there is some overlap in treatment for both OCD and epilepsy, they're generally treated distinctly and differently. For example, treatments that would overlap would be sedatives. Sedatives reduce the impact of the epileptic seizures and reduce the anxiety from OCD, whereas the OCD itself might be treated with something like antidepressants to stabilize mood, and the epilepsy itself might be treated with something like lithium. This is one of the issues with those conditions. They both require constant medication, and, unfortunately, they also require constant treatment, nominally something like a neurologist to monitor what's happening with the brain, regular consultations with physicians, and so on. This is where the implant might prove useful. The implant goes into the brain, deep into the brain, hence the name, deep brain stimulation, and it's not a new idea. For example, it's been used with Parkinson's disease, theoretically to help with epilepsy. There's also a range of other trials and developments that are underway, and this is where the, let's call it, prospects of the implant become particularly important, and not just with epilepsy and OCD, but across the board with all kinds of neurological conditions. The important thing here is that it shows to some extent that one implant can be used to treat multiple conditions, and thereby avoiding somebody looking like this. What happens with this implant is somewhat straightforward in its way it works on the brain itself. Getting to that information is the hard part. So what the researchers and clinicians had to do was expose the individual to the stimuli that led to OCD, but also find what parts of their brain were active during an epileptic seizure. And they would then hook the implant up with a wire to these locations. When the seizure or the OCD loop started, it would release a small pulse, and when this happened, it would interfere with the neurons in the areas responsible for either the OCD or for the epilepsy. This would prevent them from having the negative effects. Fortunately, because they were able to figure out not just the locations, but the signals that were telling them that it was about to happen, they could only interfere or limit the reaction to only when it was interfering with them, thereby stopping OCD and epilepsy to some extent. Shifting to what should have been ancient news, but is very much current day, Oregon in USA has been confirmed to have plague. So get out your plague doctor masks, fill them with herbs, lock everybody inside, and take your elderly out, even though they may not be dead yet. But realistically, this should not have happened. There is very little reason why plague should be coming up again. Oregon was able to deal with it 8 years ago and stop it from spreading, and people should have taken lessons away from it. Although, then again, with COVID-19, it's very clear that people don't learn lessons for very long. Yeah. The patient who was diagnosed with plague is notable for two reasons. One, they're likely to have been infected by their pet cat, which really only reinforces the point that cats are assholes. The other reason it's important is that their condition went further than most other instances of plague that have occurred. Normally, it's a case of getting flu-like symptoms and then getting over it. In this case, they began growing the bubo, or the bulbous growths full of pus. In this case, the infected woman is responding well and should be able to return home comfortably in the near future, until she gets the hospital bill. in which case she may wish to have died instead. The other news related to that is, unfortunately, you won't be able to take your elderly out to have them disposed of, no matter how cooperative the undertaker is. Next we have animal-related news, and possible anthropological and zoological evidence as to how it is that joke developed, particularly teasing amongst chimpanzees. A young chimpanzee may effectively do what a boisterous adult would do to others and slap another on their back and then act as if nothing has happened. Or a child might tap you on the shoulder and then pretend they didn't do it. But it's all to see the response, and this theoretically is what gave rise to the verbal joke that humans use, rather than the very much physical jokes that German chimpanzees are showing. In fact, we can see some of the same behavior amongst children, in fact very young children, starting from as little as 8 months, although generally a little bit older. And these sorts of playful behaviors progress, similar to the way the ape's behavior progresses. And to get this, the researchers did have to get either the PhD candidates or whichever students they happen to have to sit there and watch 75 hours of chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans playing around. Likely the crappiest job they'll have in a while, and record any observations related to those long hours of video. Shifting to less funny news, but arguably more disconcerting news, growing rice that's actually beef at the same time. Yeah, this is one of those things that you feel like something is very, very wrong with it, even though it does make sense. You can think of it in a manner of speaking as being similar to cultured meat or lab-grown meat. Meatless meat, if you wish. But it's different in that it's based on a plant, and this is where the innovation and disconcerting nature to it is. What they've done is take rice, and by combining the rice with for lack of a better way to put this, the necessary cell structures from bovine tissue to create both meat and fat, they can grow what is effectively a meat, but in rice itself. Admittedly, this is way beyond what they've done with golden rice. In fact, it's arguably way beyond any other genetically modified food. The reason that they've chosen rice is for a simple reason. It is, at least as far as foods go, and staple foods at that point, a very good candidate. It already has a lot of what you need, with 80% starch and 20% protein. Although the numbers may shift slightly depending on varieties of rice, location, and so on. By taking that already existing, known, good kind of food, and the various contents within it, they can use that as a effectively guide and structure for adding other things. In this case, we're talking about the tissues involved in bovine protein, like muscles, and fat cells. This was done in a somewhat unusual way. They had to take gelatin and coat the rice grains in this gelatin, then get food enzymes that would help to partly break down, or at least make the gelatin slightly more permeable to the bovine cells. This then allows the bovine or cow cells for meat and fat to attach itself to the rice. The rice now has what you can effectively describe as a implant or inoculum of the meat cells. This then grows in a culture dish with the various nutrients around it that allows the rice itself as a grain to be there, but also to have the muscle and fat stem cells grow around it as well. This is left to develop for 9 to 11 days. At the end of the time, the results were surprisingly spectacular. Admittedly, not as big a success as you might hope, but nonetheless somewhat spectacular. The carbohydrate levels didn't really change all that much. They pretty much added 0.2 or so grams of carbohydrates, a negligible amount. Protein, however, increased by about 1/7, or about 400 to 500 milligrams, and fat by about 10 milligrams, so again, not a significant increase. Although this is very early days, so an 8 to 10% increase for protein and 7 or so % increase for fat is a big achievement. More so when you consider that this is far easier to both grow and maintain than meatless meat is by comparison. In further news related to food, but this time, rather than promising news, it's a bit of a damper. Growing crops in space may not be a practical option. Researchers found that growing leafy greens for something like a salad aren't as safe to eat as might be hoped. Researchers, rather obviously, sent salad plants into space, and they grew them there for a time, mostly lettuce and spinach. When they returned to Earth, those samples were found to be far more vulnerable to infection with things like salmonella. Well, we should be clear. They didn't actually get to send their samples to space, sadly. What they've done is recreate microgravity, but the point is the same nonetheless. The other issue with this is that any attempt they do have to study this in the near future, assuming they do send it to space, would actually be pretty much exactly that scenario. The ISS is known to have a disquieting amount of aggressive bacteria and fungi, and so if they were to try this experiment with a plant that is known to be vulnerable, they'd likely wind up with the same aggressive species of pathogen entering into these salad plants, and, well, you can imagine what happens when you have food poisoning. All of this occurred despite the fact that the plants should have a defensive system in place to prevent bacteria, both good and bad, from entering, yet they were unable to respond in the simulated microgravity. This is a big problem, largely thinking of interstellar planets and travel between them. If there's no way to grow food, you're either going to have to cold store people through cryo-freezing, or you're going to have a lot of rations on board. Rations take up space and are often very difficult, very expensive, and taste like crap. Cryogenic storage is likely to be your other option, but again, lots of room, people aren't going to be happy about being human popsicles for a time, and as a result, this isn't really a great option either, plus the whole issue of we don't yet know how to wake people up from cryo storage. As a result, this is a big problem. It means the only way to grow food as they travel is liable to have to be done in sterile environments, and you're going to have to really hope that whatever you are growing doesn't get a disease present, because it won't go away. In related news to food, we have the nonsense of the AAP and their claims that children and pregnant women are at risk of worse health from GMO foods. We've been over this before. No, there isn't any risk. It's a bullshit article, it should never have been allowed to be published, and likely before long it will be retracted for being nonsense. It's not even that the article itself is bad. It is, mind you, but it's that all of the real-world data shows that the claims they are making are wrong. There is more than 30 years of evidence about people consuming GMOs without any adverse effects. United States of America, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and many other countries have allowed GMOs into their food chain for a long time, and yet there is nothing related to them that is adverse. Yeah, you would think that after that much time, that widespread consumption, and basically that much data, we'd know if there was a problem. Surely, at that point, it's obvious. And yet, nothing. There's been silence. This is why the AAP article is bullshit. Not just that there's that nonsense, but even if we were to assume that somehow or other the AAP article was written by people with unique and insider knowledge who somehow managed to extrapolate out those small grains of truth that everybody else has missed, they can't have done, because the 3 authors behind it don't actually have any qualifications or experience in talking about biotechnology, agriculture, and everything else that goes into crops. In fact, they're specialists in different fields. Yeah, this would be like asking Stephen Hawking to write an essay on literature. He could probably do it, but the depth and understanding of his knowledge would be limited by comparison to somebody who does specialize in literature, and likely a very specialized niche within literature, such as Shakespeare or similar. The Genetic Literacy Project goes through the nonsense in the article in a great detail, and we won't spend an hour going through it for you. You are more than capable of reading the at least 9 points, if not 10, that they make that utterly eviscerate the article in question. In related news, we have an article published showing the rise and fall of Sri Lanka and their attempt to go organic. And this does perhaps best demonstrate how it is that bullshit like the AAP article can have real-world effects. And not just real-world effects, but often very deleterious effects. Sri Lanka tried to go organic, and we say tried because what they did was give farmers very little notice and tell them, we will no longer be allowing you to use synthetic fertilizers, you'll have to use non-GMO seeds, and all sorts of other nonsense. But when this happened, the results were predictable. The food supply was restricted heavily as their productivity just fell through the floor. The food that they could produce was less nutritious, and ultimately it cost so much more because there was so much less to go around. Yeah, you can imagine what happens when food security is gone. People riot, people die. If they're not dying, they're starving because they can only get a little bit of food. Just enough not to die, but not to actually do anything. This led to the invariable outcome of the government going, oh shit, we screwed up, quickly reversed the decision. About 3 to 6 months after they'd already made the decision, and unfortunately, the damage was done. They had destroyed their economy. They literally had to ship in on aircraft the necessary artificial fertilizers to be able to get farms producing once more. And this is why people like Vandana Shiva should be held accountable for spreading this bullshit. The article in Nature goes through this information in great detail and shows the major milestones in what happened and the effects it had. A short version of it is that it's a terrible idea, don't do it. At the other end of it, we have China trying to embrace genetically modified organisms and very much in favor of having to use whatever works to get food. And this is not all that surprising, partly due to China's territorial ambitions and the likely limitations on how much food they can import once they act on those, but also the fact that their own current stores of food are in a terrible condition. And because of this, they will need to increase their own domestic production and make sure they can store that domestic production. This will be done through genetic modification. For example, their corn in storage at the moment is experiencing extreme issues to do with mold contamination. Although only some locations are known to have this issue, it's likely to not be an isolated concern. Because it's a food security problem, and the mentioned issue to do with imports in the relatively near future, it would make sense that they'd want to find ways to increase their own production and make it storable. This is why they've changed their rules around imports of GMOs and the ability to grow them. They've approved production of at least 6 more kinds of modified corn, 2 kinds of soybean, and 1 kind of cotton. The other advantage to this is that even if China does increase the number of genetically modified crops it grows throughout the country, it won't immediately see the results that they want. They will need to gradually increase the amount that they're growing. That does mean that farmers in other countries can grow the same crops and they'll already have the infrastructure and be able to get the seeds more easily and then sell them to China, something that can't otherwise be done. One of the big challenges is that to import genetically modified foods, China has to have approved them, and if it's not on the list, it doesn't get through the door. But one thing that China is not likely to be growing and trying to import is a bioluminate houseplant. This is a genetically modified houseplant that emits a luminous green glow at nighttime. Why exactly they'd want this is a different matter entirely, but nonetheless. The petunia is a weird hybridized plant. Although not costing a great deal at about $30, it's still an odd choice. The petunia has a relatively uninspired plain white flower during the day, but as the light goes down, the bioluminescent green genes within it that were derived from a mushroom begin to start glowing, initially a faint green and then gradually more green as light goes down. The initial production of these was limited to 50,000 plants though, but even with just a limited production, it shows that genetically modified plants are seeing a emerging market in day-to-day life, and not just as a agricultural niche product area. The firefly petunia is unique, not so much in that the idea of making a glowing plant is new. That's been available since the 80s. What is new is that the genetic modification has allowed them to make it completely self-contained. You no longer need feed the plant special food to make it glow. Instead, the genes from the mushroom allow it to have the necessary enzymes to undergo certain chemical reactions that then make it glow. The reaction itself involves caffeic acid, which plants make themselves. The enzyme from the mushroom then turns that caffeic acid into a light-emitting molecule called luciferin, and then it goes back into being caffeic acid. This means you don't use up any of the products, they just continuously undergo the same cyclical cycle. This, of course, is all happening at the same time as genetically modified tomatoes are also available, at least within the continental USA. Sadly, both Alaska and Hawaii do lose out in this respect. Shifting to a sort of mixture of environmental news, but also pathology and, to a lesser extent, epidemiology, or at least we hope not epidemiology. It's the emergence of frozen viruses from 750,000 years ago in the Tibetan glaciers. Although 750,000 years ago is the extreme end, at the other lower end we have 40,000 years old. These diseases have included things like viruses, parasites, bacteria, and more. Things we don't want to be seen. And mostly because if Hollywood is anything to go by, this is going to lead to something or someone becoming incredibly ill and spreading who knows what where, but most likely ending in a zombie plague. In similar historical news, we have developments in archaeology around the Mayan Empire, and more accurately, how the Mayan Empire fell. They were a fairly large, developed, and successful empire. Just look at Machu Picchu and other similar locations. They had a very well-developed society with advanced techniques, and they were able to use their limited environment to great success. And yet they died out in less than a century. It would appear this all occurred due to drought, or at least drought was one of the major contributors. The research shows that through their 800 years history, they were relatively stable until they could no longer provide food due to a lack of water. What is noteworthy is that the paper shows that over 50 years you had the fracturing of the society, the complete breakdown into individual, very small and more isolated social groups who went off to their own small villages that were more resilient to the drought. And over those 50 years that followed the initial breakup, you had consolidation of these rival groups that then ensured that the Mayan Empire remained fractured. This is not so different to other historical empires. For example, Rome. They were at one point at great risk due to the lack of food for the poorest and lowest of the working classes, and therefore they started handing out free bread in order to try and make them more compliant. And so there became a huge demand to import grain for that reason. When this grain supply was interrupted for any reason, Rome found itself in a lot of civil distress. Likely, something very similar, and likely more significantly advanced, occurred amongst the Mayans. Shifting to very modern news and technology related, we have the USA finally updating its nuclear weapons program. One of the big worries and one of the more famous problems amongst the US Army has been that their nuclear weapons silos relied on ancient floppy disks from the 1970s in order to be able to be controlled, updated, and maintained. This is absolutely ancient technology, and some of the requisite parts just aren't available. You may not even be able to buy a floppy disk anymore. And to be clear about it, we're not talking about the small ones. We're talking about 8 inches or about 20 centimeters across. Yeah. And that's the issue here. They've finally gotten around to being able to update it. Although the update itself does also now mean that the USA is better positioned to be able to launch nuclear weapons should something trigger their response, which is arguably not good news. In academic news, we have a somewhat bizarre fall from grace for a Penn State professor. The professor appears to be slowly but very much surely losing their mind. And unfortunately, they're already in trouble due to prior issues and academic problems. In this case, it's gotten worse, because they've now been charged with lewd acts involving a tree branch and Tootsie Pop in a public park. This is not a good week for them. It's not the only things they've been charged with, but it's certainly the ones that lead on headlines. They've also been charged with indecent exposure, burglary, criminal trespass, disorderly conduct, and more. And then there's accusations about what they were doing to their dog. Yeah. If the last of these are true, there's a very simple solution involving 6 men and a ordered fire. But likely they won't be getting the death penalty for what they did to their dog, although they may deserve it. Yes, academia can be hard, but nobody expects it to be hard enough that it literally breaks your mind. Something that might is the Russian cosmonaut's time in space. The Russian cosmonaut, Koneko, is currently on his 5th stint aboard the ISS, and by the end of this, approximately the end of September 2024, he will have spent 1,110 days on the ISS. That's over 3 years. 3 years in the void of space. That's enough to break somebody. And not just mentally break them, but it does have a massive toll on their body. It's why just about every other country will rotate astronauts every 6 months. They go on, stay for 6 months, and then come back to Earth. The time in space has huge impact on their bone, muscles, and more, and so when they return, they need rehabilitation. Rehabilitation just to deal with normal gravity and all the changes in their body, like the loss in bone mass, something kind of important when you're looking at, well, the ability to walk without fracturing your legs. The final news item we have for you this week is a interesting but not necessarily immediately useful development in fusion technology. Fusion, of course, being the combination of different elements to create something heavier. In the process of doing so, they will create heat. This heat can be used to then create energy. Of course, because you're combining materials, you're not getting a damaging or unwanted byproduct most of the time. Instead, you're creating something. It's been a goal for about 100 years now, and rather unsuccessfully so. Simply getting 2 different elements to smash together and create new molecules is really damn hard. It's a lot harder than Netflix and chill, we'll put it that way. What you need to do if you're going to try and get a fusion reactor is recreate what is the equivalent to our star's core, the sun's soul. You need to recreate something like this and then be able to pump something like hydrogen or similar into it to get things like then helium out of it. Even with that in mind, as the Neurologica blog points out, the output from the reactor as it stands now is about 2%, which is roughly on par with the best that current fusion reactors can produce. And understand, that was only run for 5 seconds. The challenge, as they point out, is that the models and systems we have now aren't up to the job of being able to produce anything close to what we need, because all the power that goes into the system before it's up and running, there's a huge amount of time, effort, and energy needed to get the fusion system set up, and then you start getting energy back out of it. That's not counted in the return, and unfortunately, at the moment, we're less than 1% of the way to where we need to be to get the fusion reactors to produce energy in excess to what was needed to start it. Likely, fusion energy is the future, assuming we don't find a way to access hell energy, which would carry its own problems. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.